Hello, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jessica. I am a librarian at the Chelmsford Library. While you're all joining the Zoom, I'm going to just do a quick overview of some of the other upcoming events that we have coming. Yep. So tomorrow night, I would like to let everyone know that we have a special, it's actually going to be hybrid. It's a film screening, very special film screening of a movie called The Cycle of Memory. It's by a young man who made a movie, recreated a 100-mile bike trip that his grandfather took when his grandfather was a young man. And it's because his grandfather is declining due to Alzheimer's. So he recreates the trip in order to help his grandfather to recreate the journey as well. And so that is tomorrow night, 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. In the McCarthy meeting room, or you can register to join online via Zoom. Speaking of bike trips, on Wednesday, December 14th, we have at 7 p.m. we have the best bike rides in New England. It's not exactly the best time of year, but maybe it's the best time of year to plan your next bike ride around New England. So that's going to be Wednesday, December 14th at 7 p.m. And that's going to be on Zoom. And then, of course, it is the holiday season, so we do have some holiday programming going on. Sarah Lohman, our favorite culinary historian, is going to be back online with us on Thursday, December 15th at 7 p.m. To present holiday culinary traditions. And that should be the history of holiday culinary traditions. And that's going to be on Zoom as well. And you can register on our calendar, just like you can for any of these. And then Jane O'Neill, our favorite art historian, will be back online with us on Tuesday, December 20th at 7 p.m. for Picasso's Women. So that should be really good too. And finally, another holiday program. We're going to have Brian Rose, Professor Emeritus at Fordham University, is going to, a professor of media studies, is going to talk to us about America's favorite holiday movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And that's going to be on Friday, December 23rd at 2 p.m. So make sure you take a late lunch break and join us for that one. But tonight, we welcome back our favorite traveling librarian, our favorite traveler, Jeff Clapes. Jeff is the recently retired head of reference services at the Lucius Beebe Memorial Library in Wakefield, Massachusetts, and an avid traveler and photographer. Tonight, he's going to present his talk on Budapest. And for an opulent architecture along the Danube, spas and baths from the Ottoman era to the 19th century, and elegant Parisian-style boulevards all create a unique atmosphere. Mixed in are the leftovers from a bleak era of the communist occupation, which make for compelling experiences learning about Hungary's history. And it's one of my favorite cities. And I'm really excited to hear what Jeff has to say about it. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks to everyone for coming. I see we have a good-sized crowd. If you've been to these programs before, you kind of know how it works, but I'll, in case you haven't, I'm happy to take questions through the program. Just put them in either the chat or the Q&A box, and I'll try to keep an eye on those questions as we go through, but I'm sure I'll miss some, so when the program's over, we'll make sure that we go back and catch any additional questions. But I will share my screen and we'll get started right away. And there we go. Okay. So, as I usually do to start the program, I try to kind of put things on the map so you have a rough idea of what the context is of the country that we're talking about. And in this case, Hungary, which Budapest is the capital of it. And I should mention that the pronunciation is always kind of a funny thing because the Hungarian pronunciation for the city is Budapest. And that's because in Hungarian, the the letter S is pronounced as our SH. But you will often hear it called Budapest just because international people who don't understand Hungarian, it's just easier to say that. So if you hear me pronounce it both ways during the program, don't worry about it. You'll hear that a lot. Anyway, most people who haven't actually traveled there say Budapest, and people who do say Budapest sometimes feel like they're being a little snooty. Anyway, that's my spiel on that. But that's an explanation of why you will hear it pronounced in both ways. The country, and of course it's the capital, has about 10 million people. It's roughly in geography area, it's about the size of Maine, the state of Maine. And it has been a part of the European Union for almost 20 years. 2004 was when they joined. And just a quick reminder of where Hungary fits in the complicated map of Eastern Europe. One of the things that has greatly affected its history over the centuries is that it's in a relatively flat location in between Asia, primarily Russia, Ukraine, and so forth, and also Turkey and Western Europe. So it's like many of the countries in that area, like Poland and the Czech Republic and Ukraine and so forth, it has been a crossroads, both figuratively and literally, for a lot of culture clashes throughout history. The capital itself has about 2 million people, and a little bit more if you count the metro area around it, which is about a fifth of the total population of the country. So it's once you get out of the Budapest area, it's much more rural. And like many countries that have a major capital city and a lot of countryside, it's almost like two different countries. The city is really a unique environment. It's quite old. It was originally a Celtic and Roman settlement. And the Hungarians, the ethnic Hungarians that live there now, didn't really arrive in that area until the 9th century under a dynasty called the Arpads. And they considered that the city was founded in the year 896. And in fact, they have had a number of, at the end of every century, they tend to have a big hoopla celebrating the long history of the city. It was not surprisingly attacked many times by the Mongols coming from the east, but it was also a major Renaissance city. And then it was occupied by the Ottomans. There's a whole bunch of history. I won't bore you with all the details, but I want to give you a rough idea of just how complex this city's history has been. In fact, the Ottoman Turks ruled the city for a full century and a half, starting in the mid-1500s. This is more of a topographical map, and you can see that it is, except for a few hilly regions, it's a basically fairly flat country. The western part of the country, oops, I didn't turn on my pointer, there we go. The western part of the country over here eventually became part of the Habsburg Empire. And by 1718, the city and most of the rest of the country was absorbed as well. And then for those of you who remember your 19th century European history, there were a number of continent-wide revolutions in 1848, where various places attempted and often failed to achieve independence, and Hungary was one of those. There was a revolution in Hungary at the time, but it didn't get anywhere in terms of independence. And in fact, barely 20 years later, in 1867, that brought the birth of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was so important at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1873, the important thing that happened for the city itself is that 3 different sections united, and that's where we get the modern city. Actually, Buda is, the reason it's called Buda and Pest is because Buda is the city, the district on the west side of the river, and Pest is the flatter district on the east side of the river. And there's another area called Óbuda. All three of those were united into a single municipality in 1873, and that's when the name became Budapest. And you probably remember at least the basics of what happened after that, where the Austro-Hungarian Empire lost in World War I, and Hungary declared its independence after that. But there was a lot of, there were treaties that determined the future of many European countries, and much of Austro-Hungary was partitioned, and in fact lost a significant part of its territory, roughly half, ended up becoming part of what is now the country of Romania next door, including Transylvania. Although to this day, so that's the country. If you keep heading east, you will end up in Western Romania, where there even today are a very large number of ethnic Hungarians. They are citizens of Romania, but they still speak Hungarian and are ethnic Hungarians, and they still hold on to a lot of their ethnic traditions, even today. But to dive into what the city actually looks like, this is where we stayed. We had a lovely old pension in a neighborhood in the Buda side, the west side of the river, in a neighborhood of old mansions that was very pretty. It's our room and the view out to the surrounding area. This particular part of town is kind of on a hill called Gellert, and Gellert also gives its name to a very well-known hotel and spa, which is kind of hidden down at the bottom of this photograph, at the bottom of the hill. It was named for a bishop, Bishop Gellert, who was killed in the 11th century and gave his name to the area. But one of the highlights of this neighborhood is an incredibly beautiful spa. We're going to talk a lot about that as we go through the program. There are many different baths and spas, which are just a long-standing tradition in Hungarian culture. And you can visit them as a tourist quite easily. And I would certainly encourage you to do that. I'll show you a couple of different kinds because they have very different atmospheres and very different styles. This one was built around the World War I, early 20th century period in a style called the secessionist style, with a lot of Oriental influences. The secession is actually another name for what is more commonly called Art Nouveau, because there was a similar group of artists in Vienna pursuing similar kinds of artistic ideas and similar designs. And it was called the Vienna Secession. And so it's often when you travel in Eastern Europe, you'll see that phrase used a little bit more, whereas in France and Western Europe and Belgium and so forth, it's more commonly called Art Nouveau, but the styles are very, very similar. Along with many other buildings in the city, many of them were damaged, and this spa was damaged as well and rebuilt after the war. And even if you don't actually enjoy the baths, many of these spas are worth at least sticking your head in just to see the gorgeous architecture that's inside. This one just has some incredibly beautiful interiors. With different pools, they often have different temperatures. And it's just an incredibly beautiful place to while away the afternoon. I should point out, and I'll mention this later as well, an interesting thing that we found out when we were there is that in the Hungarian healthcare system, it is not uncommon for doctors to give prescriptions to their patients to go and take cures in the spas. So you might, I can't imagine what it would be like here in Massachusetts to have my doctor say, you know what you could really use? Here's a prescription for 10 visits to the local spa. So it's kind of an odd concept for us, but they take their spas very seriously in Hungary, not just in the city. Here's the outside of the building to give you an idea of a little bit of the architecture. if you've come to my programs before, you know I studied, my undergraduate work was in architectural history, so it's something I'm always very aware of when I travel. And Budapest is just an absolutely exquisite city for street life and a wide array of different architectural styles from different time periods. And certainly a couple of the big ones that you'll see there are this Secession Art Nouveau style and a lot of Art Deco, and also very neoclassical and Baroque styles from all over the history of Europe. And that's because for quite some time, Budapest was very consciously trying to emulate Western Europe and building a lot of buildings that tried to create that sense of being an important European capital, which of course they succeeded at. It is today. And it is still, and was for much of the 19th century, considered the Paris of the East, because much of the style of the city, the wide boulevards, the beautiful buildings in these different styles really make it feel like you're strolling the streets of Paris. This is a view of that same hotel and spa complex in the evening. Budapest is also a city of bridges. The Danube, of course, divides the city and is probably the single most prominent geographical feature. Everything in the city is kind of defined by how it relates to the river, the Danube being the longest river in the European Union, at least. It's 1,800 miles long, and Budapest is probably one of the biggest ports on the river. If any of you have ever taken or considered taking a river cruise, there's no question that Budapest is almost always the eastern terminus of many of the most popular cruises. And of course, along the riverfront, you'll see a lot of some of the most important public buildings, government buildings, churches, and so forth. We'll look at a lot of those in more detail as we go along. Just some examples of some of the unusual street light buildings that you'll see along the street. This one almost, you would swear you were in Italy. One of the days that we were there, we happened to stumble upon a road race that was going on. And they went over this, the most famous bridge in the city, which is called the Széchenyi Bridge, which was the first permanent bridge over the Danube in the middle of the city. And it was constructed in 1849. And it was commissioned by Count Széchenyi, an important noble at the time, who missed his father's funeral because of the river. He couldn't get across the river. There were boats and temporary bridges and things, but because there were no permanent bridges, that was a big problem for a major port city on a major river in the middle of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. So he was the one who commissioned this bridge. And it was designed, as many bridges seem to have been in Europe, designed by a Scotsman. And it is now the most famous bridge in the city, and certainly one of the more beautiful. It was, along with many other bridges, in World War II, it was severely damaged and rebuilt after the war. There's a number of beautiful pavilions along the river. We're going to look at them in more detail a little bit later. But here's one of the major piers of the bridge. And a close-up of the people running along it. It's really quite beautiful. And I'll show you some nighttime pictures as well, because most of the bridges in the city are illuminated at night, and it's a highlight of any visit to the city to stroll along the riverfront in the evening when everything is lit up. As you're crossing the bridge, you can see on both sides We're gonna visit both sides of the river because there are some very important historical parts of the city on each side. The huge building that you're seeing on the hill in the background is called Buda Castle, up on a fairly high hill. And in the background here is the Matthias Church, which we'll also see. And a little bit closer view. We're going to visit that later. But as you cross this bridge, one of the first buildings that you see is also one of the more famous buildings in the city called the Gresham Palace Hotel, which was built in 1906. It was originally built actually as an office building. It served in World War II for the Red Army from Russia as barracks. Then it became an apartment building. It's had quite a complicated life, but now it is a Four Seasons hotel and incredibly luxurious and in a very convenient location, but it's been completely restored inside and out. And the detail on the building is really quite something. It is certainly one of the more luxurious hotels in the city and quite expensive. You would expect to spend several $100s a night. And that is certainly not necessary. Budapest also has plenty of very inexpensive places to stay. So you can be as luxurious or as economical as you choose to be. Moving along the river, here's another building very close to the riverfront called the Ethnographic Museum. And it's interesting in and of itself, but also because it was a runner-up in a competitive design for the Parliament building, which is by far the most famous building. We're going to see that next. The Supreme Court of Hungary was once located in this building. By far the most famous and most iconic building in the city is the most recognized building, certainly, is the Parliament building. This is the Hungarian Parliament, built in an extravagant neo-Gothic design, and it stretches for quite a ways along the riverfront. It is, in fact, the third largest Parliament building in the world, and was built in the latter part of the last couple of decades of the 19th century, starting in about 1885. And it was the result of a competition, an architectural competition. And this was the one that won, but a couple of the other buildings, designs that were runners-up were built right across the street. The Ethnographic Museum was one of them, and I'll show you another one in a minute, in a very different style. You may think that this reminds you a little bit of the Houses of Parliament in London along the Thames River, and you'd be correct, because the style is very similar, and that was a very conscious decision, actually. The design is kind of based on London's, and the interior as well. If you've ever toured the Houses of Parliament in London, you'll see they're quite similar. It has almost 700 rooms, and they have excellent guided tours of the interior. It also, of course, being the Parliament, it's an important building for the modern government of Hungary, but it also has a lot of history there. It houses the 1,000-year-old crown, because Budapest basically considers that it began in the year 1000. So they had a huge celebration 20 years ago. And the crown from the original king is now kept in the Parliament building. Interestingly, there's a story about that. During World War II, they removed, like many countries, they hid a lot of their most valuable artworks and other things. And the historic crown of 1,000-year-old crown of Hungary was, you'll never guess where it ended up, but it was in Fort Knox here in the United States. It was kept in Fort Knox between World War II and up until the Carter administration. And finally, at that point in 1978, President Jimmy Carter returned it to Hungary, and now it resides again back where it belongs in their parliament. But you'll notice the interior is very reminiscent of that over-the-top neo-Gothic style, so common in Britain as well. Here's the interior of the Parliament chamber, but the details are also incredible. There's stained glass everywhere. The unusual kind of zigzaggy thing that you see along the bottom is kind of curious. This was in the hallway outside the Parliament building, and what it was designed for is that when all the politicians were mingling in the hallway waiting for various things to happen, they would all be smoking cigars. And so, of course, they needed to sometimes put their cigar down. So this was designed for them to rest their cigar in a numbered slot so that they would know which one was theirs and they could get it later. The grand entrance hall is also quite impressive. So I think if you do happen to visit the city and are there only for a brief period, like a day or an afternoon on a river cruise, this is probably the one site that you're going to want to make sure you see, because it's the highlight of the city. Even today, it is still the largest building in all of Hungary, believe it or not. But there's so much else to see in the city, and I take you around. Not far from Parliament is a lovely park. And this statue is kind of interesting. I have to tell you a little bit more history about it. This is a statue of a politician called Imre Nagy, and was originally made in 1996 in a square called Martyrs Square. And it was a very beloved statue, but it was moved. Nagy was a hero of the 1956 anti-Soviet uprising after the Soviets invaded. And so there was a little controversy over the years as various governments have moved this statue from one part of the city to the others. He was part of the October 1956 uprising against the Soviet invasion, which lasted a very short time, because within 2 weeks the Soviets had pretty much put down any kind of opposition, and something around 3,000 Hungarians died. But Nagy, who was a communist at the time, was declared prime minister, but didn't last very long, because he was hanged in 1958, just 2 years later, for his role in the uprising. But the square in this area is quite pretty and surrounded again by some very beautiful, beautiful buildings, including the U.S. Embassy. And this monument that you can see here is kind of still controversial today. It's a monument to the Soviet liberation from the Nazis, which of course has some interesting historical overtones, because it's certainly, while it was beneficial to have the Nazis pushed out, it was kind of out of the frying pan into the fire, as we know from later history. There is even a statue of Reagan. He is fairly well regarded for his honor, to honor him for his role in the fall of communism. This was put up in the square in 2011. This building is no longer the post office, but it used to be, and it's a wonderful example of the secessionist or Art Nouveau style. And pretty much everywhere you look, particularly if you look up, you will see the most fantastic architecture from all different time periods. The huge building at the end of this street, this is a pedestrian street actually, is St. Stephen's Roman Catholic Basilica, and it's named in honor of St. Stephen, who was the first king of Hungary. He was born in I believe, 975, but he served as the first Christian king of the Hungarian nation from the year 1000, when it was supposedly founded, up to 1038 when he died. His right hand is still actually 1,000 years old, is kept in this church in a reliquary. It's a more recent church, obviously, built in the neoclassical style and built in 1905. But it has a very dramatic interior and a lot of exquisite decoration covered with gold. And it has a nice pedestrian plaza around it now, which is much preferable to what was there before. Originally, this was a giant parking lot, and they put the parking lot underneath and now have turned it into a beautiful cathedral plaza. As we go through, you're going to see a lot of just architectural shots like this, because I want to give you just a sampling of the variety of beautiful buildings that you will see if you stroll the streets, and ordinary street life, daily life as well. This one, in fact, reminded me very much, if you've traveled in Italy, this could be an Italian Renaissance palace that you might see in Florence, for example. And then these are very good examples of ceramic tile, which was a very popular thing during the arts and crafts movement and the Art Nouveau movement as well, not just inside, but also on the outsides of buildings. And a view across the river, we're going to, in a little bit, we're going to cross and wander around the hill where the castle district is. Another of the most beautiful bridges in the city is called the Margaret Bridge, which was built in the 1870s by a French designer. And in fact, it could easily, you could imagine it being in Paris. It's an interesting bridge. It's the only one on the river that's actually a three-way bridge, because it connects an island, Margaret Island, which is an island in the middle. The river goes on both sides of it, and it's a huge park. And the Margaret Bridge connects both sides of the river, but stops on the island in the middle. Here's the elaborate main train station, which is not too far from there. Another of the more incredible Art Nouveau buildings. I'm trying to keep an eye on the questions. I should, let's see if there are any I can answer. What time of the year was I there? This trip was in the fall, so sort of mid to late September, which is actually a very good time to travel in Europe in general, and definitely here, because there's not quite as many tourists. The weather is still generally pleasant, and the temperatures are comfortable, and the prices come down a little bit. Is Budapest wheelchair accessible? A lot of European cities aren't. I don't think I could answer that very accurately, because it's not an issue I'm terribly worried about when I travel, but I know it's important to a lot of people, not just who may be in wheelchairs, but who have mobility issues of all different kinds. There is a lot of climbing and walking in Budapest, and there's a lot of cobbled streets. So I think if you are a traveler who has to is worried about your knees, or does have a wheelchair, or any other kinds of mobility problems, I would definitely make a point to investigate some good guidebooks that will often talk about how accessible things are for disabled travelers. But in general, a lot of Eastern European cities are nowhere near as advanced in those kinds of accommodations as in the United States, that's for sure. Are there Buddhists in Budapest? I don't know. I imagine there might be a few. The names have nothing to do with each other. But there might be, but I would imagine they are very much in the minority. There is a Jewish population. I'm going to talk about that later because one of the things we're going to see very soon is the major synagogue, which is another major site to see. So I'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. The colored roof tiles on a lot of these buildings, the churches, and particularly the Art Nouveau buildings, yes, they are original. I wouldn't doubt that many of them have been restored because of damage during the war, but those particular kinds of styles are very common to Art Nouveau and secessionist style architecture. So yeah, they would have been original to the buildings. And safety, Budapest is generally a pretty safe city. Certainly as safe as any other European capital, and safer in many ways than many places you might travel in the United States. Walking around at night, as long as you are following basic common sense, like don't walk alone at night in a dark park, and that kind of thing. There's a lot of nightlife, a lot of street life, so it would be unlikely that unless you were out at 2 in the morning, there's going to be lots and lots of people walking the streets and lots of shops and restaurants open. Street crime, other than just being aware of pickpocketing and things like that in crowds, there's not too much in the way of violent crime against tourists. So no, I think you could, I would say that Budapest is definitely a generally safe city for tourists. And English is widely spoken for the simple reason that nobody speaks Hungarian except the Hungarians. So it's a difficult language to learn. And given how cosmopolitan the city is and how many international tourists are there, English is very widely spoken. Certainly in any hotel, restaurant, tourist site, you're going to have no trouble getting by with English, although, as I always say, it's worth it to learn a few basic phrases just to be polite, and try to bridge the gap and learn how to say please and thank you and good morning, so forth. But Hungarian's a pretty difficult language, so you may not get much beyond that. I loved, this is, I only took this photo because I like the idea of a fatal restaurant. Obviously, that's not what it means. It's a name in Hungarian. And just some more amazing details of some of the buildings. This is the Liberty Bridge, another one of the many bridges across the Danube, built in the 1890s. And if you're interested in bridges and interested in the construction and the engineering aspect of all that, this bridge actually has, in one of the buildings at the end of the bridge, they have a little museum that talks about the history of the bridges in the city over the river, which is kind of interesting if you like that. And not far from there is this really weird looking building, which is an old warehouse building that was built along the river for shipping and transport of loading of goods onto ships and so forth. But the elaborate glass and steel structure over it is a more recent addition, and it was turned into an art center and shopping arcade. So it's just kind of an interesting modern thing along the river. More Art Nouveau. And here is the market hall very close to this bridge, which was built for the Millennium Celebration, the Hungarian Millennium Celebration in 1896, and renovated about 20 years or so ago. It's another building that has the multicolored tiled roofs. It looks almost like a train station, but it isn't. It was built as a huge market hall to showcase regional products and crafts. It even has tunnels underground that connect it to the river, where ships unloading goods could unload them in all weather underground directly into the market. And it's fantastic. This is the side view, just showing you how enormous the structure is. And when you get inside, you could spend a whole day in here just looking at all the different shops. Obviously, it specializes in products from Hungary and Eastern Europe, so it's almost like a museum of Eastern European food and crafts and so forth. There are restaurants where you can eat, mostly on the second floor. And there's meat, there's fish, there's fruits and vegetables, ubiquitous peppers, which are prominent in Hungarian cooking, spices, all kinds of things like honey and wine. Tokaj is one of the more famous wines out of Hungary. Hungary produces some pretty good wines, although they don't tend to get exported to the US very often, with the possible exception of Tokaj, which is a fairly expensive and very well-regarded sweet dessert wine. There's all kinds of pickled things, and of course, paprika. I loved the idea here where paprika comes in both hot and sweet varieties, depending on what you like. And for some reason, they decided that the women are sweet and the men are hot on this packaging. Getting back to the question about the Jewish population, you can probably guess a little bit about what that history involves. This is the Great Synagogue. It is the largest synagogue in all of Europe and seats 3,000 worshipers, built in the 1850s, excuse me, in a sort of Byzantine neo-Moorish style. And it also has, connected to the synagogue itself, is an absolutely superb museum of Jewish relics from the history of Jews in the city over the centuries. Obviously, the Holocaust had a huge effect on the population. They used to be pre-World War II, like around the turn of the 20th century, roughly 25% of the population of the city was Jewish. Now, after the tragic events of the 20th century, the entire country of Hungary is estimated to have somewhere between 50 and 100,000 Jews. So it's obviously it's a very sad history. But this is, regardless of your own personal religious views or your family or your connections, everyone needs to visit this this site, because it's an exquisite building, and it also, the story that it tells about the history of those people in this country is incredibly moving. It has, there are two towers, which is kind of interesting for a synagogue. It's not normally what you would see in synagogue construction, but in some ways it helps to make it resemble a Christian church a little bit. And it even has a biblical origin, because some of the biblical descriptions of Solomon's temple refer to it having had two towers. So that's some of why the design is the way it is. But the interior is just absolutely spectacular. Here you can see some of the incredible details. And again, because of the time period that it was built, a lot of the interior decoration is typical of that period of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Also part of the complex, there is a Holocaust memorial, which was completed in 1991. The main element of it is this tree made out of metal called the Tree of Life. It's a sculpture in memory of 600,000 Hungarian Jews who lost their lives in the Holocaust. And it's interesting, it was partly funded by Tony Curtis, the American actor who actually was Hungarian American. His birth name was Bernard Schwartz. I don't know whether he would have ended up being as famous and popular if he had kept his name, but the fact that he did do so well as Tony Curtis, he donated a significant amount of money back to his home country, his ancestral country, to help build this monument. And each of these, the tree is kind of looks like a willow tree with all these very slender little metal leaves, and each one of those leaves represents a particular person, and names are inscribed on them. It's an unbelievably moving experience to be there. And again, just some more interesting little details if you keep your eye out as you're walking around the city. But I do want to take you across the river now. This is looking down over the chain bridge, the main bridge that I mentioned earlier, over the Gresham Palace Hotel and off to St. Stephen's Basilica off in the distance. You can climb the hill, or if you don't feel like that, you can take a funicular, which will take you all the way up to Buda Hill and the Castle District, which has a very different atmosphere because it's high up, and whereas the Pest side of the river is very flat and tends to have more of a grid pattern to the streets, a very 19th century style. Buda is a much older part of the city, and so a lot of the structures are older, and there's a lot of little narrow pedestrian medieval style alleys, which give it a very different personality. The legend that goes along with this neighborhood is that a mythical bird called a Turul bird led the Magyars, who were the ancestors of the modern Hungarian nation, led them west across the plains, and the bird dropped his sword here on top of this hill, and that's where the city was founded. The building on the left, kind of unassuming little building, is Sandor Palace, which is an old mansion, but is now used as the office of the president, who, if you have been following any of the news and politics, you know the current leader is Viktor Orban, who has steered Hungary considerably further to the right in recent years, since we were there, which was a few years ago, and is kind of becoming a thorn in the side of some of the other countries in the European Union. The biggest building on the hill is the Royal Palace, which is kind of it's an overbearing building, and it's kind of a mishmash of reconstructions, much of which were done after World War II, and it now houses the National Gallery. It's rather more impressive from the outside than the inside. But certainly one of the best things about being up here is the view that you see from the top of the hill up and down the river, where there are fantastic views to the Parliament building and all the other beautiful structures along the riverfront and off over Pest. But the neighborhood also has all kinds of fun old style buildings. Many of them are from the Baroque era because, as I said, this is the oldest part of the city. So there are structures that are considerably older than the ones on the eastern side of the river in Pest. This is the square in front of the Matthias Church, which I'll show you in a sec. And this is a statue to the Holy Trinity. And there they are. The Matthias Church is, it is not the biggest church in the city, but it is certainly one of the most beautiful and one of the most historic. It's 800 years old, although most of the building that you see here is from the late 19th century again, and was rebuilt and restored after World War II. You'll see a lot of crows on the building. If I can find one here, oh, there's one. And that's because a popular Renaissance king, Matthias Corvinus, whose name is associated with the church, his symbol was the crow, Corvinus being Latin for crow. So you will see a lot of that kind of symbolism anytime there's anything having to do, there's one. There's anything having to do with Matthias. Another excellent example of Eastern European church roofs. If you've traveled anywhere else in Eastern Europe, like Romania, Croatia, even Prague, places like that, this is a very common design style in Eastern Europe. And right adjacent to this is the Fisherman's Bastion, which is another one of those monuments that is very often on the cover of, if you buy a guidebook to Budapest, this is often one of the images that you'll see right on the cover. It was built in 1896, again, for that millennium celebration. A lot of construction happened in the city at that time in order to celebrate the 1000th year founding of the city. And it has 7 towers like this one here to symbolize the 7 Magyar tribes that united and became the modern Hungarian ethnos. And here's St. Stephen up there on his horse. It's a wonderful place to just sort of walk around. There's all kinds of little hidden alleyways and sculptures and stairways, and the views, because this is on the bastion way up high on the top of the hill, the view across the city is just stunning. Here's Parliament, and here's looking up north towards the Margaret Bridge over the spires of Baroque church to St. Anne. You may wonder why it's called the Fisherman's Bastion, because it's several hundred feet up above the river, where you wouldn't expect fishermen to be. But the original reason for the name is that supposedly this part of the medieval castle fortress and the protective walls was supposedly under the protection and funding of the Fishermen's Guild. Back in those days, different guilds, the guilds of fishermen, guilds of builders, guilds of goldsmiths, guilds of whatever. And it was the Fishermen's Guild that supposedly was responsible for this particular section of wall where the bastion has now been constructed. Here's St. Stephen. And as a reminder, he was the first king of Hungary, the first Christian king of the modern, I shouldn't say modern, but the first king of the nation of Hungary as it identified itself as a nation. And he was king for almost 40 years, starting in the year 1000. The interior of the church is also quite beautiful. And again, as old as the building is, much of the decoration that you see again is from the late 19th century and definitely looks it. Has a very Gothic revival style to it. And they do have, these are not the originals because those are in Parliament, but these are replicas of the royal crown and scepter and crown jewels. The whole castle district is a wonderful place to stroll around. There's a number of pedestrian streets, beautiful Baroque buildings. It's very pedestrian friendly. There's shops and cafes and so forth. And as always, an interesting mix of architecture. Here's an excellent example of the new butting up against the old. This old historic tower, which has a kind of unsuccessful modern top stuck on it, is sandwiched in between the building on the right is now the Hilton Hotel, and the ugly thing on the left is kind of modern office building that I don't think that really does it justice. But there's more than enough in this area that is just really very beautiful architecture. It reminded me a lot of Prague. If you have traveled to Prague, Prague also is a city that has uh, a castle hill that's sort of the oldest part of the city, and then a flatter, more modern city on the opposite side. And I could definitely see some comparisons between the two places. Also up there is this more recent building, but massive building, which turns out to be the National Archives. The riverfront in the afternoon is also very beautiful because there's just the light hits the buildings. And it's very, very pretty. And as I mentioned earlier, do make sure you spend some time wandering around at night because the buildings are lit up in spectacular fashion. And it's a pretty walkable city. It's a big city and it's a sprawling city, but much of what we're seeing right now is in a relatively small stretch of the central part of the city along the riverfront. I do need to point out one interesting thing. This is kind of a fuzzy photograph because it was taken late at night. This is an important, also a World War II monument. And it was installed in 2005. These are shoes, replicas of shoes made out of bronze. And they are a memorial along the riverfront to the 3,500 people, about a quarter of whom were Jews, who were shot and dumped in the river in 1944 and 1945. Their bodies, they were simply, their possessions were taken away from them. They were shot and dumped into the river, and their bodies were just taken away by the river. The reason the shoes are such an important symbol is because their shoes were removed before they were shot, because the soldiers could sell the shoes and trade them. They were actually a reasonably marketable commodity during the war. So it's a haunting reminder as you stroll along this modern, beautiful waterfront of a fairly recent and tragic history. I do need to talk again about baths. I think I saw a question go by about thermal baths. And yes, I did go to thermal baths. I went to a couple of different ones. And I would urge you to do at least one. But there are many different ones to choose from, and they have different styles. I went to this one, which is called the Rudish baths, or Rudish, I should say, Rudish baths, which is one of the oldest in the city. And it's kind of fun because the dome that you can see here, which looks very Ottoman, is in fact Ottoman. And the funny little bumps that you can see on it are colored glass that is that allows light to stream into the bathing rooms inside. So this particular bath has a very Turkish, Eastern, Ottoman flavor to it. You can see here the light comes streaming through the steam. And like many baths, there are different temperatures. So you have cool temperatures, and they actually have, this one had a central bath in the middle, and then there were 4 different smaller baths around the outside, each of which had a different temperature, which was indicated on the side. So you could decide whether you want to move from hot to cold and whatever. This is not my photo, this is a postcard that just gives you a better idea of what it looks like when it's not full of steam and people. But it is very old and historic. It is the oldest bath in the city. So it's a unique experience that is very different from some of the other baths that I'm going to show you a little bit later on. Just some more details of old and new, and weird. Also along the river, this is the Vigado Concert Hall, which was built in the 1850s and has some beautiful both interior and exteriors. Like many of the buildings I've shown you, it was heavily damaged during World War II and went through a very long restoration after the war, but has been beautifully brought back to its original glory. And close by is this funny little statue that you might think is incredibly important, and it isn't really. It's from the 1970s, and it was done by a Hungarian artist simply to represent his daughter, who liked to dress up as a little princess. So he did this statue, gave it to the city, and it has become like the Little Mermaid and Mannequin Pis and various other statues in cities in Europe. It's become a beloved favorite, even though it isn't terribly historic, but it's cute and has become a symbol of the city. Lest you think that Budapest is full of gorgeous architecture, I do have to point out that every once in a while you will come across something atrocious like this. There is plenty of stuff that was built during the communist era, and fortunately, you don't come upon it too often, at least in the historic center of the city, but it is there. But you're actually much more likely to see things like this. I loved this one with these naked people sticking their heads out of the windows. I'm going to take you just quickly to a day trip, or even a half day trip. It's not very far out of the city. You can go on your own, or you can take an organized tour if you wish. It's something called Memento Park, which is about, it's only a few miles southwest of the city. And you could easily go for just a couple hours. It's an interesting place just because it brings together a lot of the communist and socialist realist era art that was formerly all over the city and all over the country into one place. Not so much to revere it and commemorate it as to think about it from a historical perspective. The biggest element in the park is this one, which is a recreation of Stalin's grandstand in Heroes Square, which we'll see towards the end of the program. And in 1956, during the anti-Soviet uprising, the huge statue of Stalin was actually cut off at the knees. And this is a replica of it here. But there's a variety of genuine statues and sculptures and monuments collected from the communist era that have been put into this huge park. From different time periods, representing different people. Much of it, of course, has that very early, like 1920s, 1930s style to it. Even Lenin himself. And here they have a nice little museum that is part of the park. And this is just to give you an idea of what that grandstand was actually all about, and the scale of it. When it originally stood in the Heroes Square, you can see just how enormous the statue and the grandstand that it stood on is compared to human scale. In addition to many bridges in the city, there are some beautiful parks. This is the Margaret Bridge that we've seen before, and it takes you to Margaret Island, which is probably the single biggest park in the city. And it's wonderful because it's so close, but once you get out onto it, because it's an island in the middle of the river, you feel very separated from the city. It has an interesting story. In the Middle Ages, there was a king, King Bela, who asked God to save Hungary from the Tatars who were invading from the east. And he said that if God protected the country, he would dedicate his daughter Margaret to the church. So things went his way, and he sent her to the nunnery on the island. At a later point, he wanted her to make a very convenient marriage for political purposes, and she refused. So she became Saint Margaret and spent the rest of her days in the nunnery. So now you can actually see the ruins of it here. These are the old foundations. And now the entire island is a major public park with all different kinds of playing fields and gardens. There's this observation tower and views up and down the river, playgrounds for children. It's a beautiful way to kind of escape the urbanness of the rest of the city simply by walking across a bridge. Here's another bridge, the Elizabeth Bridge, which is named after a queen from Austro-Hungary. It's not one of the nicest bridges in the city. It was built around 1900 and used to be fancier, but again, it was destroyed in the war. So what you see here is virtually a complete rebuilding of the bridge along the original design, but it's a little bit more stripped down. So this one didn't get finished until the 1960s. And right across from that, if you cross that bridge, you can climb Gellert Hill, where we started. That's where our guest house was located, to a place called a park where there's this enormous statue called the Liberty Statue, where there is a beautiful park and again, spectacular views. You're a little bit further down. This is, you can see Castle Hill and the Fisherman's Bastion just a little way down the river. So this is a nice area that's just a little bit off to the side that gives you a view not only of that, but the whole sweep of the Danube as it goes up, heads up north. Actually, I should say the view looks north. The river is actually going south in the other direction. And there are some wonderful views across Pest as well, where you can see any city worth its salt seems to need to have a giant Ferris wheel these days, and the St. Stephen's Basilica. And even a good view of the market hall from way up high. This is that art center that I showed you earlier. And of course, there are countless river cruise boats going up and down. This is, as I said at the beginning, Budapest is probably one of the major and busiest river cruise ports for European river cruising. And it is often the start or end point, just because it has the largest facilities and is one of the largest cities on the route. This is looking south. You can see the Gellert Spa, which was the very first thing we looked at the beginning of the presentation. And more cruise boats. And just beyond Gellert is the enormous Budapest University of Technology and Economics. Here you can see just how massive the Buda Castle is up on its hill. I need to mention, again, we talked a little bit about Hungarian as a language. Hungarian is a language that does not have very many close relatives among other European languages. So it's not like if you know some French or if you know some German, you can pick it up. It really is quite different. This one is this sign in a park. Simply, I had to look this up. It simply says, "We welcome our guests to the park." But as I said, you really don't need to know Hungarian in order to enjoy the city. Learning a few basic phrases always helps and is a nice way to break the ice when you're dealing with people. But it's a pretty complicated language, and you will easily be able to get by with English or almost any other major European language if you happen to know any. A little bit further down the river, we explored this just for fun because I saw some pictures of it. This is a recent, it was, I want to say it's been built in like the last, well, certainly within the last decade, big state-of-the-art performance center called the Palace of Arts. So they have music and theater and art shows, dance, all kinds of things. It's an enormous complex with multiple buildings. And they have an incredible light show at night. The building, not only is the building lit up, but it changes color. I should have taken a video to show you because the lights and it's just an incredible light show. Even if you don't go to a performance, just walking around the neighborhood and seeing this along the river is quite something. Heading towards the end of our program, I'm going to take you down one of the major streets of the city, and we'll end up in Heroes Park, or Hero Square, I should say, and the major city park and another of the major spas. And we are now on the east side of the river again. This is Pest, and it is generally flat, unlike Buda on the other side that's extremely hilly. And it feels much more Parisian. It is mostly developed in the 19th century, so much of the construction that you see there, the buildings are all very consciously emulating that European, Western European style of building. And this street that we're on right now, which heads east from the river all the way out to the park, and it's a good 2 miles long, give or take, is called Andrassy Ut, and it's named for a count who was a very important politician in the mid-19th century, and he wanted a grand avenue for the city to rival the Champs-Élysées in Paris. And this is Budapest's version of that, and they did a pretty good job. This is the State Opera House with its elaborate entrance and fancy lobby, again with some just incredible interior details. This is another place where if you don't go to a performance, you're still welcome to stick your head in and look at some of the interiors. Right across the street is an old building from the 1880s called the Drexler Palace. And this was used for many years as the National Academy of Dance. And unfortunately, it's for a number of years now, it's been closed and vacant. And I haven't heard anything about whether it's going to be restored or what they might be able to do with it. But it's still pretty impressive just from the outside. And something that's fun to do if you're in this neighborhood is to take the historic subway line, which follows a straight line right under Andrassy for the 2 miles that it goes all the way to the park. It was actually the first on the continent. That's not counting the British Isles, but in continental Europe, this was actually the first underground subway. And it started in 1896, and it was built to get people to the Heroes Park. Again, remember, 1896 was a very important year because it was the millennial, part of the millennial celebration. So all kinds of construction and things were going on. So there's an enormous park, which we'll see in a sec. And this was the way that they built this new very snazzy new transport system to get people to that park. The original system actually used horse-drawn carriages underground. And what kind of makes it fun is that it still operates as a part of the Budapest metro system, but it's incredibly shallow. This was a brand new street, so they weren't building tunnels in an existing part of the city that had already been developed. So you only really go down a short flight of steps, not much longer than one you might have in your house, and you're underground, and there's the subway. They no longer use horse-drawn carriages, as you can imagine, but they do have the old cars, which are a lot of fun, and the old subway tile. And it operates as any other line on the metro system, so it's a lot of fun to try. And I would encourage you also, the easiest way to get around the city is by far is public transport. There's no need to rent a car in Budapest. There are excellent bus services and excellent metro services. This is one of the modern metro stations. You can see this is obviously very different and much deeper to give you an idea of just how far down below ground the modern system is. But walking on Draci Út is also very pleasant because it is, again, it's trying to feel Parisian. It's designed for elegant strolling in that French style, and there are lots of old mansions that you can see along the way. One of which here has been turned into a kind of unusual thing to do on vacation. This is called the Terror Museum, which may not seem like the sort of thing you do when you're on holiday, but it's another must-see if you're interested in history. It is the former headquarters of the Nazis during World War II and the communist secret police. Hungary during World War II was kind of trying to play both sides against the middle. But Hitler finally invaded and installed a government there. And then in 1944 and 45, the Red Army invaded and ousted the Germans. So it's a complex history. And the Terror Museum, on the outside of the building, there is a memorial with photographs of hundreds of people who were killed by the secret police during this time period. It's one of the most superb history museums I've been in anywhere. And it may seem very depressing, and obviously it's a depressing part of history, but the way they teach that history is so incredibly well done that I would urge you, if you ever go to the city, make sure you do not miss this place to learn about such an important part of not just the city, but the whole country's 20th century history. And then you can keep going if you work your way down on Draci Út. This I thought was kind of an interesting example of the inequality, where we have a juxtaposition of someone driving a Lamborghini, and right across the street is one of the old communist era cars, which are quite common still. You'll see them driving around. And again, beautiful buildings, many of which in this stretch of the street are now used as foreign embassies, kind of an embassy row. And at the end, you will come to this massive Heroes Square, which was again built starting around 1896 for the millennial celebrations. And this elaborate arrangement of statues here, they're much bigger than they look when you get up close to them, has 21 statues of famous saints and kings and revolutionaries from different periods in Hungarian history. And right behind it is the large 300-acre city park, which we'll see in a second as well. On either side of this big square, there are two important art museums, if you're interested in that. One is called the Museum of Fine Arts, and the other one is the Palace of Art, and they have excellent collections of paintings and sculptures and other kinds of things. And the buildings themselves are also quite beautiful. But it's almost an outdoor museum of uh, Hungary's most well-regarded and famous people throughout its history. On a quirky thing right along here we are next to it. There's a street that goes along this park called Parade Street, which used to be used for massive communist gatherings back decades ago. And it has this unusual sculpture called the Time Wheel, which was installed in 2004, the year that Hungary entered the European Union. It's essentially what it is it's a big, I've blanked on what we call them, hourglass, where the sand goes through from one side to the other and then it turns over. The big joke, of course, is that it doesn't work anymore. So it's considered kind of symbolic that it was designed for Hungary's entry into the European Union, but it doesn't actually do anything. For many of the people on the anti-EU side in Hungary, this is a symbol of what they stand for. Right across the street, just to give you an idea of how varied the city is, this is ING, I think is I forget where they're from. I want to say they're Dutch, but I'm not sure. It's a big financial services company in Europe, but this building could not be more different from the art museums, classical art museums that are right across the street. And another important monument in this stretch is a monument to the 1956 uprising, and it was installed for the 50th anniversary of that when they rose up against the Soviet invasion. And it is an enormous convergence of these rusted steel columns, which represent the masses of working class people coming together. And as you move through the sculpture, you can actually walk inside it as you move further and further. The massive metal columns come together, become less rusty, and then join together in a brilliantly shiny stainless steel point at the top. So it's laden with symbolism, but it's actually quite impressive even to this day. The area around behind Hero Square is called City Park. In Hungarian, it's Városliget, and it was the site of an enormous expo kind of celebration for the millennium. So it has a zoo, there are restaurants, pavilions, children's park, and so forth. But one of the most fascinating things there is this collection of completely fake castles. This is Vádja Hunyad Castle. It's built entirely out of wood, or at least the original was built out of wood, and people liked it so much that they recreated a lot of these structures that were supposed to be temporary for the exhibition. So they've rebuilt a number of these historic buildings representing Hungarian architecture from different time periods. There's Romanesque, there's Gothic, there's Baroque, there's Renaissance. And so now it is a permanent structure, and it's used for all kinds of public events and art exhibitions and so forth. Believe it or not, they even have a statue of George Washington in this park. So it makes it a nice area to stroll around. I saw some people commenting about the weather, and we had a mix of sun and clouds. It never was terribly bad, but Budapest, even on a gray day, is still a beautiful city. But if you get lucky and have some sunny days like this, it's even nicer. You can go boating in the park on the lakes. There are all kinds of outdoor cafes. And this unusual sculpture is to anonymous, believe it or not, although a specific anonymous, actually. It was the unknown chronicler at the court of King Bela. Remember him? He was the one who had the daughter Margaret, who ended up in the nunnery. And Bela had a chronicler whose name is lost to history, but he wrote a very important history of the early Magyar people and the Hungarian nation. So he is, even though we don't know who he is memorialized here in this sculpture. Here's another Romanesque church that, again, this is not a real church. It's a complete replica from the expo 100 years ago. And I'm going to end the program at another of the bathhouses, which is certainly the most famous and completely different from the one I showed you earlier. This is Széchenyi Baths. It's the largest in Europe and was built right before World War I in 1913 in a very neo-Baroque style, and is on the edge of this big city park. It was named after a very important 19th century statesman and politician named István Széchenyi. And this is the other side. The buildings are absolutely extravagant, particularly the part that's all painted in this lemon yellow color. And this aerial shot, I just wanted to give you an idea of just how big and complex this whole arrangement is. This is the park entrance, and then this is the street entrance. There are outdoor pools, huge outdoor pools, which are all at different temperatures. And then inside the building, there are a whole series of different, there are saunas at different temperatures. There are bathing pools, massage services, you name it. And here's the main lobby where you go in. The details of the building is just, it's just gorgeous. As I mentioned earlier, Hungarians go here regularly, often on the advice of their doctor. But it's a very social thing, as well as just an enjoyable thing. The baths do have minerals in them. They don't smell of sulfur exactly, but they do have a number of other kinds of minerals, and the temperatures are all over the place depending on what happens to appeal to you. You can be indoors or outdoors. And you can spend the whole day there if you feel like it. It is, if you're visiting and don't happen to have a swimsuit and towels and all of that, that's not a problem. I believe I checked the prices this week just out of curiosity, and I think the Széchenyi baths, if you just spend, the afternoon enjoying the pools, and the indoor saunas, it's about 20 euros or so, so it's certainly not expensive. And you can rent bathing caps and towels and lockers for your belongings and so forth, if you don't happen to have them with you when you travel there. I think if I were to pick only one spa or bath to go to, I think I would go to this one, just because it's huge, it has so much variety, and it is clearly one of the most popular places for the locals to go. It's full of ordinary city dwellers who are just there enjoying an incredibly, they're just so lucky to have this as an amenity. You'll see people like this playing cards, playing backgammon, reading in the water. There are lockers where you can store your belongings, and dressing rooms where you can get changed. Here's the local crowd playing chess. And the buildings alone are worth it. The surroundings are just incredible. And then when you're done, if you're now totally relaxed, you can go right around the corner and visit the Art Deco Zoo that has a fairly nice collection of animals, but even more so, I just thought it had the most amazing buildings. This is the tower where I think this was for the, was this the giraffes or the elephant? You can go up to the top of this tower and get a view of the animals that are walking around the enclosure. And then they have just the most amazing buildings. And then when you're done, go out for dinner. I saw a few questions go by about the food. Hungary or Budapest being such a cosmopolitan city, you will find all kinds of restaurants for any imaginable ethnic food that you might want. But Hungarian food is delicious. It is very, you'll find a lot of food made from local ingredients. You'll find it tends to be very what you might imagine your Eastern European food being. There's a lot of meat and vegetable kind of stuff, potatoes, and sour cream, and paprika is often used, but Hungarian food is quite diverse. They have delicious desserts with cherries, and because Hungary was under the influence of the Austrians and also the Ottoman Turks for so long, you would also see an interesting mix of influences from Turkish food and from Austrian pastries. It's this is a country that, as I said, is quite literally at a crossroads of so many different cultures, and as a result, metaphorically, their history has been has served as a crossroads, and their culture and their cuisine and their architecture is all like that too. They have taken little bits and pieces from all of the different peoples who have passed through, and some who have stayed. And so I think it's what makes it such an incredible destination. And probably if you've never been to Eastern Europe, this is certainly the first place to start, I think. You could easily spend a week or more, and then that's just seeing the city before you even start to explore around the outside and the rest of Hungary. So I'll stop the presentation there. I'm going to go back through our questions to make sure. I'm going to see if I've missed any questions in the chat. Let's see. Someone mentioned Hungarians are proud of their chocolate. Yes, chocolate and any number of other kinds of desserts as well. How long was I there? This was actually part of a trip that we took both in Hungary and primarily Romania. So I want to say we were in Budapest for about 5 days. And then we took the train into Romania and rented a car there and spent a good 2 weeks driving around Romania. But I think for the city itself, if you're not planning to do a lot of exploring of the countryside up and down the river or other parts of Hungary, you could certainly do the basics of Budapest, I think, in say 3 days, but I think you'd be cheating yourself. I would give yourself longer than that if you really want to explore, because there's an awful lot to see, particularly if you want to explore some of the museums and take a couple of day trips, or there are river trips that you can take. If you take a river cruise, and someone asked me about, do I have any recommendations for river cruises? I don't, because I've never personally been on one. And I know a lot of people who have been on them who enjoyed them very much, partly because they tend to be, they're smaller than the big cruise ships that have 6,000 passengers. So I think they're a little more intimate, and they stop at a lot of small places that are just a little more off the beaten path. But many of them either start or end in Budapest, and a lot of people I know who have taken them will spend time either at the beginning or the end of their river cruise to get more time in the city. And I think that's well worth doing if you are considering that kind of trip. Why is everything so huge? I'm not quite sure what that question means.
I think that was referring to the Monuments Park.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, that's because all of those monuments were built during the communist era where they were making a point. And even today, many of, the Statue of Liberty is pretty big too. So when you're trying to make a political statement with a monument, you make it big. It is kind of interesting that in that particular park, many of the former Soviet states have reacted differently to their subsequent history. Some of them have toppled all their statues and melted them down, and it depends. But it's interesting that here they actually saved a whole bunch of them and put them together so that they can go and learn from them and
Sure.
and see their history. When I think of the controversy that we have here, it's kind of similar. We have a controversy in recent years here with things like Confederate statues. And
yeah. And that would be interesting to see if we end up taking those and putting them
instead
in
of
a park.
taking them down, what if we were to do something like this, where we don't put them out of sight forever, but we try to understand where they came from and what they represented. And yeah, I don't know, every country handles things differently.
It's interesting. I did have a question here. I know you talked a little bit about the food, but what is the specialty? I know paprika is very big. And so that kind of stew, what's that stew called?
There's lots of stews, paprikash.
Yeah.
And paprikash is really easy to make. I make it a lot here at home. But like I said, they use a lot of sour cream, and a lot of the food can be very rich. It's very filling. But that's the more traditional food, and you certainly don't need to eat that, because you'll also find gastro Hungarian food with like you'd find anywhere in a city like this that's so cosmopolitan. We went out one night and had really, really good Greek food in a restaurant.
Yeah.
One of the best Greek restaurants I've been in a long time, like in the middle of Budapest. You'll find French restaurants and Italian restaurants, but definitely enjoy the local specialties. And honestly, I think one of the best ways to do that without spending a lot of money and having a big variety is to go to that huge market.
Oh yeah, it was amazing. Yeah,
because
it's really cool.
That market, the second floor of that market, is mostly like food court, restaurant-y kind of places. So you can look at a lot of the local delicacies and talk to the people about what they are, and it's like a food museum. And then you could try different things without necessarily having to pick a restaurant and choose from their menu.
Yeah, that's a great idea. That that market was really amazing. And then someone was asking about the weather. I think you might have addressed that already.
Yeah, I mean, the weather, you never know anywhere. But fall is not a bad time to be there. And we didn't have horrible, I mean, it was cloudy a couple of days, but it wasn't cold, and it wasn't rainy or anything like that. Winter is, like, right now is not probably a good time to go. But I love going to Europe in spring and fall because the weather tends to stay reasonably pleasant. Unless you're going to the beach, the weather is very comfortable, and it's the prices are lower, and the crowds aren't as bad. So yeah, this particular trip was in sort of second half of September, early October, and it was
nice.
a lovely time to be there.
And then I think a couple of people have asked about how you plan your trips. Do you use a travel agent, or do you just use your own research and friends or something like that?
I I do my own, and I do a lot of stuff on the internet. I still do read a lot of good old-fashioned guidebooks. They're getting fewer and farther between. A lot of the big publishers that people remember are have either gone out of business or are really cutting back their print publications. But there's still a lot of good ones out there. And even if you're, I use them a lot just to get the lay of the land and find out, you know, what do I want to see? What are the best neighborhoods to hang out in? You know, that kind of thing. And for hotels, I use Airbnb, I use Booking.com, I use Hotels.com. One of the advantages of the internet is that you can, and things like Google Earth, you can actually see exactly where that hotel is.
Yeah.
So even though it has beautiful pictures on its website, you can see, oh yeah, but there's a gas station right across the street. And you have, if you're willing to do that kind of work, you have a lot more information at your fingertips than you used to. Right?
Yeah, no,
however,
I mean, it seems like if you're really interested in having like a package deal, then some of those places like Viking Cruises or even Road Scholar. I know one of your
I know a lot of
presenters
people who've done Road Scholars.
Who or what's the other one? The Circle, it's got Circle in the title.
I know the one you mean.
But your attendee who had asked about wheelchair access, I think they think a lot about those kinds of accessibility.
Exactly. I
Grand
think
Circle,
really,
that's what it is. Yeah.
Yes, I think it really depends on what kind of a traveler you are and what things are important to you. I tend to travel independently. That's just me.
Yeah.
I hate tours, not because they're bad, but because I'm a control freak and I want to go where I want, when I want, and all that kind of stuff. But for other types of travelers, it's perfect. You don't have to think about dealing with your own stuff. You have somebody to take care of things. And I know a lot of people who've taken river cruises and Rick Steve tours and things like that, and they were marvelous because they were exactly what that traveler needed.
Right.
And so I think you just have to kind of be honest with yourself about what matters to you. What are you comfortable with? Are you okay driving in a foreign country or not? Or, you know, ask yourself those kinds of questions, and then that'll help you decide what's the right way to see a place.
Well, this was awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. We really appreciate it. Oh, goulash. I guess goulash is
goulash. Yes.
Yeah,
goulash.
That's one of the.
Goulash is not really a recipe. It's the goulash is the Hungarian word for stew. So
yeah, right.
It's basically you'll find 100 different goulash recipes depending on where you go, but it's very hearty peasant food. That's and it's delicious. I will again put and borscht. Somebody mentioned borscht. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
I will put my email. Everyone.
Wonderful, and there are just so many accolades, Jeff, for your presentation tonight. Thank you so much. And
I just threw my email in the chat. If anyone has any other questions or specific questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Feel free to email me. And
fantastic. I will share that with the recording tomorrow, and I will also pick out some of these, any references that anyone made during the chat tomorrow as well. And I thank you so much for another great trip, Jeff. And I hope we can have you again soon. Have a great trip to
me too. Yes,
Italy.
I'm leaving for Italy tomorrow, so I'll have a presentation for that sometime in the next couple of months, and maybe I'll be able to share that with you guys. So thanks for having me, and thanks for joining.
Fantastic. Bye, everyone. Good night.
Bye.